The Price of Easy, A Journey to Real Wealth. Chapter 1, The Golden Bubble. When I was young, I genuinely believed that life was a simple, effortless game. I never worried about anything, mostly because my father had a lot of money. I didn't care about my grades, I didn't study much, and the concept of having a job was completely foreign to me. I lived in a bubble where every wish was instantly granted. If I saw a nice watch or a new gadget in a store window, I just asked my father, and he bought it for me without a second thought. My friends would sometimes talk about college degrees and career plans, telling me I needed to prepare for the future, but I just laughed at them. In my mind, their worries were pointless. Why should I spend my time working or stressing over a career? My father had built a fortune, and to me, that wealth was an endless well. My daily routine was completely focused on pleasure. Every single morning I would wake up late, usually past noon, and enjoy a luxurious breakfast right in my bed. I would spend hours mindlessly watching TV or scrolling through my phone. In the evenings, I went out with my friends. We lived like celebrities. We dined at the most exclusive, expensive restaurants in the city, wore designer clothes that cost more than most people's rent, and drove ridiculously fast sports cars. Life was just one big, endless party, and I foolishly assumed it would stay exactly like this forever. I never gave a single thought to the concept of money or the effort required to earn it. Whenever the mood struck me to travel, I booked a first-class ticket. If I wanted new designer shoes, I bought them on the spot. When a new smartphone was released, I didn't just buy it, I bought the most expensive model available. My father quietly paid the bills for all my extravagant habits. I never stopped to consider the long hours he spent at the office, the stress he endured, or how incredibly hard he worked to provide this lifestyle. I never even bothered to ask him how his business was doing. I was entirely absorbed in my own pleasure, living only for today and completely ignoring tomorrow. Chapter 2, The Wake-Up Call. Then, one unexpected day, the bubble popped. My father called me into his study. The moment I walked in, I noticed he looked incredibly serious. He pointed to a chair and simply told me to sit down. "Son, we need to talk," he said, his voice heavy. I offered my usual easy smile and replied, "Yes, father," but his expression remained stone cold. He wasn't smiling, he wasn't happy, and he certainly wasn't in the mood for jokes. For the first time in my life, a wave of genuine nervousness washed over me, though I couldn't quite understand why. My father had always been a gentle and generous man who never said the word no to me. But on this particular afternoon, the atmosphere in the room was entirely different. He took a long, deep breath, looked me straight in the eyes, and delivered a reality check. "You are not a child anymore," he said firmly. "You must start thinking about your future." I chuckled, brushing off his concern. "Father, I have absolutely everything I need," I replied confidently. He slowly shook his head. "No, my son, you only have everything because I work incredibly hard. But life is not always this easy, and one day, things may suddenly change." I was completely oblivious to his deeper meaning. I assumed he was just stressed from work and worrying for absolutely no reason. I kept my confident smile and told him not to worry, assuring him that nothing in our perfect lives was going to change. He didn't return my smile. He just stared at me in silence for what felt like an eternity, before finally whispering, "We will see." I brushed off the strange encounter, convinced he was simply in a bad mood. I stood up, walked out of the room, and immediately pushed his warning out of my mind. That night, I went right back to my usual routine, going out with my wealthy friends, laughing loudly, and spending obscene amounts of his money. I had absolutely no idea that my entire universe was about to flip upside down. Chapter 3, A Different Side of the City. The very next morning, true to my habits, I woke up late. I stretched comfortably in my massive bed and lazily grabbed my phone. My screen was flooded with messages from my friends, already making plans for our next expensive outing. Smiling to myself, I got out of bed, put on my finest designer clothes, sprayed on an overpriced cologne, and confidently walked downstairs. But as soon as I reached the living room, my plans shattered. My father was sitting there, waiting for me. His face was just as stern as the day before. "Sit down," he ordered. I let out a loud, annoyed sigh and slumped into a chair. "Father, I really have plans today," I complained. He completely ignored my protest. He looked right through me and repeated his earlier warning. "You are not a boy anymore. You must learn about how real life actually works." I dramatically rolled my eyes. "Father, I know all about life," I shot back defensively. He shook his head in disappointment. "No, you really do not," he replied quietly. Then, he gave me a command that took me completely by surprise. "Come with me." Confused and a little irritated, I followed him out the front door. He walked straight to his car and got in the driver's seat. I sat in the passenger seat, waiting for an explanation, but he didn't utter a single word. He just started the engine and began driving. As we drove away from our wealthy neighborhood, the city outside the windows began to transform. I saw a side of the world I had always ignored. I saw regular people walking quickly to catch buses. I saw sanitation workers diligently cleaning the city streets. I saw street vendors standing on the sides of busy roads, selling hot food to rushing pedestrians. Before this exact moment, these people had essentially been invisible to me. Eventually, my father pulled the car over and stopped in a neighborhood I had never set foot in. The buildings here were weathered and old, the sidewalks were cluttered, and the people walking past us looked physically exhausted. My father pointed his finger toward a tired-looking man running a small fruit stand. "Look closely at him," my father instructed. "That man wakes up before dawn every single day. He stands there and works all day long. He doesn't take long rests, and he never complains. He does all of this just to put food on the table for his family." I stared at the vendor, completely speechless. Then, my father pointed to a tiny, cramped shop across the street. Inside, through the dusty window, I could see an elderly woman hunched over a sewing machine, carefully stitching clothes. "She has been doing that exact same work for 40 years, my father told me. "She barely has any money to her name, but she wakes up and works hard every single day of her life." I watched the old woman's worn hands move across the fabric. She looked incredibly tired, but she never paused her rhythm. She just kept working. I had never truly looked at people like this before. I had never spent a second wondering about their lives or their struggles. My father finally turned his gaze back to me. "Do you see it now?" he asked softly. "Life is not a luxury resort for everyone. Most people have to grind and work hard every single day just to survive. But you, my son, you have never worked a single day in your entire life." A heavy, uncomfortable feeling settled in my chest. I desperately wanted to defend myself, to say something clever, but the words wouldn't come. I could only look away in shame. For the very first time in my 20-something years, my ego vanished. I felt incredibly small. Something fundamental inside my mind had just clicked and shifted. We got back into the car in total silence. As my father drove us away, I just sat there staring out the window, completely lost in my thoughts. The vivid images of the exhausted fruit vendor and the relentless old seamstress were burned into my brain. My life had been nothing but comfort and ease, but suddenly I felt profoundly different. Chapter 4. The Bottom Rung. After driving for a while, my father stopped the car once again. I looked out the window and realized we were parked right in front of his massive corporate office building. I had been inside a few times before, but I never stayed for more than a few minutes, usually just long enough to ask him for extra cash before leaving. "Come," he instructed, stepping out of the car. I followed him through the grand glass doors. The lobby and the office floors were chaotic and bustling with intense energy. Employees were power walking down the hallways, office phones were constantly ringing, and stacks of important documents were everywhere. My father led me past the chaos and straight into his spacious, quiet executive office. He sat behind his large mahogany desk and locked eyes with me. "Do you actually know what it is I do here every day?" he asked. I offered a dismissive shrug. "You work," I replied simply. He nodded slowly. "Yes, but do you have any idea how hard I actually work?" I had no answer for him, so I kept my mouth shut. He leaned forward. "I wake up before the sun. I make massive, high-stakes decisions. I solve complex problems that threaten this entire business. I carry the weight of taking care of this company and everyone in it. And I have done all of this for decades, for you." I turned and looked out the glass walls of his office, observing the rows of tired employees in the main work area. I saw people desperately typing up reports, others aggressively negotiating on phone calls, and many who just looked completely overwhelmed by stress. I realized with a sickening feeling that I had only ever cared about the money my father handed me. I had been completely blind to the blood, sweat, and tears it took to generate it. For the first time, a sharp pang of true guilt hit my stomach. Before I could process the emotion, my father slid a cheap, small notebook across his desk. "Starting tomorrow," he announced with total authority, "you will be working here." I actually laughed out loud, thinking it was a bizarre joke. "Me? Work?" I scoffed. He didn't so much as crack a smile. "Yes," he replied coldly. "You are going to start at the absolute bottom of this company. You are going to learn." I was genuinely horrified. "But I don't need to work," I argued. He shook his head firmly. "Yes, you do. Because one day, I am not going to be here anymore. And when that day comes, what exactly are you going to do?" His question paralyzed me. I had honestly never pictured a universe where my father wasn't around to pay for things. I had never planned for the future or cared about anything beyond my own immediate luxury and comfort. But looking at his face, I knew the debate was over. I had absolutely zero choice in the matter. He had made his final ruling. Tomorrow, my endless vacation was over. Tomorrow, I was going to have a job. Chapter 5. Welcome to the real world. When my alarm went off at dawn the next morning, it felt like physical torture. My body was so conditioned to sleeping until noon that waking up early felt entirely unnatural. But knowing I had no way out, I dragged myself out of bed, put on a simple outfit, and made my way downstairs. My father was standing by the door, waiting. He handed me a small, unassuming brown paper bag. "Your lunch," he stated simply. I stared at the bag in pure shock. "Lunch? Can't I just go grab something at a nice restaurant nearby?" I complained. He shook his head without sympathy. "Real workers pack their own lunch," he told me. "And starting today, you are a worker." We drove to the corporate building, but he didn't guide me to the luxurious executive floor. Instead, he led me down a narrow hallway into a small, cramped, and windowless back room. The room was packed with small desks where several employees were aggressively typing on computers. A tall, incredibly serious-looking man wearing thick glasses approached us. "This is Mr. William," my father introduced him. "You will be working directly under his supervision." And without another word of encouragement or goodbye, my father turned around and walked out, leaving me to my fate. Mr. William didn't offer a warm greeting. "Come with me," he barked, walking away at a brisk pace. I hurried to keep up. He led me to a tiny, uncomfortable chair behind a tiny, cluttered desk. "Your job is to check these documents," he instructed, violently dropping a massive, intimidating stack of papers right in front of me. "You are going to look closely at all these numbers, locate the errors, and mark them clearly." I stared at the mountain of paperwork in disbelief. "Are you serious? All of them?" I asked weakly. Mr. William just nodded sharply. Yes, and I expect you to work fast. I took a deep breath, sat down in the uncomfortable chair, and began. For the first 20 minutes, it didn't seem too terrible, but after a full hour of staring at tiny spreadsheets, a massive headache began pounding behind my eyes. The endless rows of numbers started to blur together on the page. My vision felt strained, and my brain begged for a break. I desperately wanted to stop and check my phone, but I quickly realized that wasn't an option. Everyone else in the room was laser-focused on their screens. Nobody was chatting, nobody was taking a quick break, nobody was scrolling social media. This was the polar opposite of my previous life. This was the harsh reality of real work. By the time the clock struck noon, I felt like I had run a marathon. I was mentally exhausted. I reached under my desk and opened the brown paper bag my father had given me. Inside was just basic, simple food. A far cry from the gourmet truffle pasta and expensive sparkling water I was used to consuming. I ate my sandwich in silence, observing my new coworkers. They practically inhaled their food so they could rush right back to their duties. There were no 2-hour lunch breaks filled with gossip and laughter. It was just eat, survive, and keep working. I deeply missed my freedom. I missed my comfortable bed and my fast cars. But buried underneath that self-pity, an unfamiliar emotion was starting to take root. Respect. I realized these people subjected themselves to this grueling routine every single day. And now, whether I liked it or not, I was one of them. The second half of the day was significantly worse. My lower back throbbed with pain from the cheap office chair, and my fingers cramped from constantly gripping a pen. I was desperate to pack up and go home, but I was trapped. Eventually, Mr. William marched over to inspect my progress. He aggressively flipped through the pages I had checked, immediately pointing out several mistakes I had overlooked. "Do it again," he commanded coldly. I let out an angry sigh. The old me would have thrown a tantrum and stormed out. I desperately wanted to argue with him, but something stopped me. Instead of yelling, I just nodded silently, grabbed a fresh pen, and started the entire miserable process over again. When 5 p.m. finally arrived, I felt completely transformed. I was physically drained, but my perspective had shifted permanently. For the first time in my existence, I truly comprehended the sheer willpower it takes to grind through a workday. I finally understood that money was not a magical, endless resource. It was the direct result of exhausting labor. As I dragged my feet out of the office building, I spotted my father's car waiting at the curb. When I got in, he didn't bother asking me how my day went. He just looked at my tired face and offered a small, genuine smile. And for the first time in my life, I smiled back at him. I wasn't smiling because I was happy or because life was easy. I smiled because, for the very first time, I felt like I had actually earned the right to. Chapter 6. The Long Climb. The alarm clock showed no mercy the following morning. When I tried to get out of bed, every muscle in my body protested. My back was incredibly sore, and my hands felt stiff and completely alien. I had never experienced this kind of physical fatigue from simply sitting at a desk. The urge to pull the blankets over my head and skip the day was overwhelmingly strong. But I forced myself upright. I had a job, and I couldn't just run away. I threw on my clothes and limped downstairs. My father was already seated at the kitchen table. He took one look at my exhausted posture and gave a curt nod. "Good," he muttered. It was only one word, but the tone of his voice carried a weight I hadn't heard before. It sounded like actual pride. When I finally arrived at the small back office, Mr. William was already hovering. He offered absolutely zero sympathy for my stiffness. "You were much too slow yesterday," he criticized bluntly. "Today, you need to work faster." My jaw clenched. I wanted to snap back, to tell him how much my head was throbbing, but I swallowed my pride. I sat in my uncomfortable chair and faced the new mountain of paperwork waiting for me. The numbers were just as blurry, my head still ached, and my spine screamed in protest, but I pushed through the discomfort. I simply put my head down and worked. I refused to stop. By lunchtime, I had actually managed to finish my assigned stack of papers. Mr. William marched over, grabbed the stack, and scrutinized my marks. He paused, looked at the papers, and then looked at me. He found significantly fewer errors than the day before. Better, he grunted. It was just a single, grudging word, but the dopamine rush it gave me was indescribable. Hearing that simple, better, felt a million times more rewarding than walking into a boutique and swiping my father's credit card for a luxury watch. It felt infinitely more satisfying than wasting another pointless evening drinking with my friends. It felt like I had finally accomplished something real and tangible in the real world. This sense of genuine accomplishment was a completely foreign drug to me, and to my absolute shock, I realized I cared about the work. When the lunch break hit, I didn't eat alone in silence like the previous day. I pulled up a chair and joined a group of my coworkers. As we ate our cheap sandwiches, I listened to them chat. They talked passionately about their kids, their spouses, their financial struggles, and their small victories. They laughed at bad jokes and shared their humanity. Before this week, I had never given a second thought to the complicated lives of working-class people. But sitting there in that cramped break room, I felt a deep connection to them. I was no longer the spoiled rich kid. I was just another worker in the trenches. The afternoon shift was brutal. Mr. William, seeing I had finished my morning tasks, dropped an even larger stack of files onto my desk. "Let's see if you can handle this volume," he challenged. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to complain that it was unfair, but I bit my tongue. I just gave him a determined nod. I locked my focus onto the screen. The hours dragged on endlessly. My lower back was in agony, and my wrists ached deeply, but I refused to give up. I was fueled by a burning desire to prove that I wasn't worthless. I didn't just want to prove it to Mr. William or my father. I desperately needed to prove it to myself. When the shift finally ended, Mr. William walked by and glanced at my completed pile. He still refused to smile, but he offered two crucial words: "Not bad." Those two syllables felt like a gold medal. I nodded respectfully and headed out to the parking lot, where my father was waiting in the car. He looked at my slumped shoulders. "Tired?" he asked knowingly. I gave a weak nod. A warm smile spread across his face. "Good," he said softly. At that exact moment, the puzzle pieces finally snapped together in my mind. I completely understood his master plan. I understood why he had forcefully dragged me out of my comfortable fantasy world and thrown me into the fire. And the most shocking part was this: for the very first time in my life, I didn't want to run away from the struggle. I wanted to show up the next day, work harder, and learn more. Chapter 7: Earning the Keys to the Kingdom. The relentless grind continued. Single days slowly turned into agonizing weeks, and those weeks eventually blossomed into months. I showed up to that cramped back office every single day without fail. The beginning of the journey remained incredibly tough. My body constantly ached, and my brain frequently felt fried by 3 p.m. But as the calendar pages flipped, a subtle transformation occurred. I started getting much better at the job. My eye for detail sharpened. I made significantly fewer careless errors, and my speed drastically improved. Mr. William remained a tough boss. He still rarely smiled, but his constant complaining and correcting finally faded away. Once in a while, when I handled a particularly difficult file, he would actually look me in the eye and say, "Good job." Earning that tiny bit of validation from a tough manager felt more incredible than any expensive birthday gift I had ever unwrapped. Through this grueling process, my entire relationship with money was rewritten. In my past life, money was simply numbers on a screen that I used to buy pleasure. Now, I looked at $100 bill and saw the exact number of hours, the eye strain, and the backaches it took to generate it. I also began to observe my father through an entirely new lens. From my desk, I watched him navigate the corporate battlefield. I saw him make gut-wrenching decisions that impacted hundreds of families. I saw him expertly put out massive corporate fires and steer the massive ship that was his company. In my ignorant youth, I had never given him an ounce of respect for his career. But now, filled with first-hand experience, my respect for him was boundless. I realized he wasn't just a rich guy who got lucky. He was a brilliant, resilient man who had built a massive empire using nothing but his own two hands and his relentless work ethic. One quiet evening, long after most employees had gone home, my father called me up to his executive office. I walked in, exhausted but proud of my day's work. He just stared at me for a very long, silent minute. Finally, he spoke. "You have changed," he observed quietly. I didn't know how to respond, so I just stood there. He continued, his voice thick with emotion. "When we started this, you were lazy. You were arrogant. You didn't care about the value of work or the people who do it. But looking at you now, I see that you finally understand." I slowly nodded. He was absolutely right. The spoiled, entitled boy who used to wake up at noon was dead and buried. I felt entirely different. My character felt solid. I felt internally strong. Then, my father did something that shocked me to my core. He reached into his desk drawer, pulled out a small, shiny silver key, and held it out to me. "This is the key to your new office," he announced proudly. My jaw practically hit the floor. My own office?" I stammered, completely bewildered. He nodded with a wide, genuine smile. "Yes, you have proven that you are ready to handle more responsibility. You have put in the hard hours at the bottom. Now, it is time for you to take the next step forward in this company." I slowly reached out and took the key. It was a tiny piece of metal, but sitting in my palm, it felt incredibly heavy. I realized it wasn't just a key to a room with a door. It was a physical symbol of my father's trust and respect. The very next morning, I moved my things into my new workspace. It wasn't a massive executive suite by any means. It was quite small, honestly. But that didn't matter. It was mine. I finally had my own private desk, a comfortable chair, and complex projects that required real brain power. I was no longer just the guy in the back room checking numbers. I was stepping into a role where I was finally learning how to be a leader. The transition certainly wasn't a walk in the park. I made plenty of stupid mistakes, and I had days where I wanted to pull my hair out from the stress. But the crucial difference was this. I never once thought about quitting. I simply kept grinding. I kept absorbing information like a sponge. My new goal in life wasn't to spend my father's money. My goal was to become exactly like him. I wanted to prove that I could build something magnificent entirely on my own. When I look back on the boy I used to be, I honestly have to laugh at his sheer ignorance. I used to think that a good life meant an easy life. I thought having endless money without effort was the ultimate dream. But my journey taught me how wrong I was. True life is found in the work. Life is defined by the effort you expend and the sweat on your brow. Life is about having the courage to build something meaningful with your very own hands. My father didn't just give me a job. He gave me the greatest lesson a man can learn. And as I sit in my office today, staring out at the city skyline, I know deep in my soul that I am truly ready for whatever the future holds. I am not secure because I have a rich father or a thick bank account. I am secure because, finally, I have learned exactly what it takes to earn it.